Chapter 10. What is killing our sheep? Louis became more drawn to medical concerns. However, no one on his staff had a medical degree. This hampered his researches. Louis could not legally perform even the simplest operation. He had to call on a doctor merely to lance a boil to extract the bacteria. I must have a doctor on my staff, Louis told Pierre Duclos, his former assistant. Pierre had become a chemistry teacher. You should interview Emile Roux for the post, Pierre Duclos told Louis Pasteur. He attended my chemistry classes and was brilliant in them. He is a physician now, one of the first to be trained in the germ theory of disease. It will delight him to work with the man who established that theory. After meeting Emile Roux, Louis agreed that they should work together. He offered Emile Roux a position on his staff, and the young physician agreed. Emile Roux proved to be an expert medical assistant. Louis also asked Charles Chamberlain, a young graduate of École Normale, to join his staff. Chamberlain had special skills in designing equipment for the study of microorganisms. He invented a filter capable of separating tiny bacteria from the fluid that contained them. Louis Pasteur always insisted that Emile Roux and Charles Chamberlain served not as his assistants, but as his co-workers. Whenever he issued a scientific report, he included their names on it. He freely gave them credit for all the effort they put into his scientific triumphs. In 1878, Louis Pasteur took up the study of anthrax, a disease that killed livestock. From ancient times, herds of animals died from this mysterious illness. People in Bible times knew it as murrain, one of the 10 plagues put upon Egypt. Anthrax was a frightful disease. Usually it killed livestock like sheep, cattle, and oxen. Humans could die from it, too. It could strike suddenly. Animals unfortunate enough to get infected with the disease almost always died in a few hours. As usual, Louis left the laboratory to study the disease firsthand in the field. He studied a flock of sheep. The shepherd pointed to a sheep that had fallen behind the others. "That's a sick one," the shepherd said. "See how its head droops. It is unsteady on its legs, and it is gasping for breath." Louis Pasteur watched and waited. The shepherd said, "Sometimes a sick animal will look drowsy and slow. Death can come so quickly that the animal is cold and stiff before I'm aware it has the disease." The sheep soon died. Louis did an autopsy on the body. The blood had turned a horrible black. The word anthrax is from a Greek word meaning charcoal, a reference to the black blood. The farmer told Louis, in some French provinces, 20 sheep out of every 100 die. Occasionally, the losses reach half of the flock. A farmer unfortunate enough to have his flock stricken with anthrax faces ruin. Louis met with a group of farmers. "What do you do to prevent the disease?" Louis asked them. "What do the veterinarians tell you to do?" "Bah," one farmer said. "Veterinarians have no cure for the disease. This doesn't prevent them from giving advice. My veterinarian blames the disease on unhealthy conditions, tainted food, poorly ventilated air, and crowded pens. He tells me to keep them in pens that are warm and damp." His neighbor spoke. "My veterinarian tells me that the only way to save a stricken flock is to take them to another meadow. He thinks the ground should be cool and damp." The first farmer said, "We must abandon entirely some grazing land because so much of the livestock dies." His neighbor said, "Some fields do seem accursed. Animals grazing there often died, while animals grazing in nearby fields stayed perfectly healthy. No one can tell us why some fields are accursed while others are perfectly harmless. Can you, Monsieur Pasteur?" "No," Louis admitted. Unknown to Louis, a young country doctor in Germany, Robert Koch, embarked upon a study of anthrax too. Except for a microscope given to him by his wife, Robert Koch's laboratory in his home contained no professional equipment. Instead, he used ordinary household utensils like kitchen plates and jars. With this primitive equipment, he traced the complete life cycle of the anthrax bacteria. Robert Koch published his research. His paper described in the most intricate details the life cycle of the anthrax bacteria and how it caused the disease. To his surprise, Robert Koch discovered that anthrax bacteria could exist in 2 forms. He wrote, "One form of the bacteria is the long, thread-like cells that other researchers have noticed. The other form is a tough, round body." He called this second form of spore. Spores, Robert Koch explained, can resist heat, cold, and other adverse conditions. When conditions turn against anthrax bacteria, they draw themselves into tough spores. The spores can survive freezing winters and hot, dry summers. Robert Koch shot the spores into the bloodstreams of mice. The spores sprang back into full life and did their deadly business. Louis read Robert Koch's paper and instantly saw the answer to the farmer's question. Louis told his assistants, "The spores explain why the disease might survive from one year to the next. When the body of an anthrax victim decays, it leaves behind the hardy little spores. The spores can infect the soil and stay there for months or even years waiting for new victims." For the first time in his scientific career, Louis Pasteur found himself far behind, trying to catch up. For 20 years, Louis Pasteur had been out in front, blazing a trail through unexplored scientific territory. Suddenly, he found himself overtaken and surpassed by Robert Koch. Marie wondered what Louis would do. "Will you drop your study of anthrax?" Grimly, Louis Pasteur said, "He'll continue." At first, he merely dealt with loose ends that Robert Koch had left unfinished. For instance, some scientists didn't fully accept the thread-like bacteria as the cause of anthrax. These critics said, the germs may not cause the disease. There could be some toxic chemical in the blood, which no one has yet detected. This poisonous chemical, not the bacteria, is the true cause of anthrax. Louis designed an experiment to settle the question. Suppose he repeatedly diluted a sample of blood that came from an anthrax victim. If a microorganism caused a disease, then it would grow and reproduce. It would fill the diluted sample, making it as deadly as the original. If a toxic chemical caused the disease, then the sample would become weaker and less deadly as he diluted it. Louis took a microscopic drop of blood from an animal that had died of anthrax. He purified the drop so that it contained, as nearly as he could tell, nothing but clear liquid and the thread-like bodies. He added the drop to a flask holding 2 ounces of sterile growing solution. He let it set for several hours to give the bacteria time to reproduce and fill the flask. He extracted a single drop and added it to a second flask. After another delay, he took a drop from the second flask and transferred it to a third, and so on. By repeating this process 40 times, Louis diluted the original drop to an extent nearly impossible to imagine. Suppose the original drop had contained the strongest poison on Earth. A drop from the 40th flask would be so weak that the poison could not have been detected by even the most sensitive methods. A human being could drink it in perfect safety. On the other hand, suppose a microorganism caused anthrax. A drop from the final flask would be as deadly as a drop from the first. Louis injected a rabbit with a drop from the final flask. The rabbit promptly died of anthrax. Louis declared, "Anthrax is a disease caused by the thread-like bacteria." However, the critics raised another objection. "It is not the bacteria that causes the disease," the critics said, "but a substance that they release." Louis called in Charles Chamberlain, and they worked on this objection. "We'll pass the anthrax culture through your filter," Louis told Charles. "We'll separate the bacteria from the clear liquid." Charles understood. "Then we'll inject the clear liquid into a rabbit. If the rabbit remains healthy, this will show that the bacteria had not released poison into the clear liquid. The clear liquid had no effect upon the rabbit." In addition, Louis let a flask containing the bacteria set for a long time. The germs settled to the bottom. Louis drew 2 samples from the flask, one from the top and one from the bottom. He injected animals with samples from each level. The sample from the top, filled with clear liquid, proved perfectly harmless. The sample from the bottom, filled with bacteria, proved especially deadly. This experiment was a simple and direct proof of the germ theory of disease. Anthrax bacteria alone caused the disease, Louis stated. These experiments should have overcome the most determined objections. However, Louis still received criticism from physicians and veterinarians. Professor Collin of the veterinarian school at Alfort took a lead in belittling Pasteur's work. He found objections in every report Louis issued. Both men belonged to the Academy of Medicine. One day at a meeting of the Academy of Medicine, Louis mentioned that hens could not get anthrax. Louis Pasteur said, "Birds such as chickens never die of anthrax, even when I inject a strong dose of the anthrax bacteria into their bodies." Professor Collin immediately replied, "Nothing could be easier than to give anthrax to hens." "Since you say hens can contract it so easily," Louis said, "please send me a hen suffering from that disease." "You shall have it," Professor Collin assured him. At the end of a week, Louis saw Professor Collin coming into his laboratory. Even before he shook hands with him, Louis asked, "Why have you not brought me the diseased hen?" "Trust me," Professor Collin answered. "You shall have it next week." About this time, Louis left on vacation. On his return at the first meeting of the Academy of Medicine, Louis went to Professor Collin. "Well," Louis insisted, "where is my dying hen?" "I have only just begun experimenting again," Professor Collins said. "In a few days, I will bring you a hen suffering from anthrax." Days passed, then weeks. Louis kept insisting upon seeing a sick hen. Professor Collin kept making new promises. Each time Professor Collin would appear before the Academy with a lame excuse. "I regret that I have not until now been able to hand to Monsieur Pasteur a hen dying of anthrax. The two that I had brought for that purpose were inoculated several times with very active blood, but neither of them has fallen ill." He tried to make light of his failure by offering a humorous reason for cutting the trial short. He said, perhaps the experiment might have succeeded afterward, but one fine day, a greedy dog prevented that by eating up the two birds, whose cage had probably been badly closed. The members of the Academy laughed at this story. However, Louis Pasteur didn't let his critic escape so easily. Louis kept asking for proof of Professor Collin's claim that birds could get anthrax. Finally, Professor Collin had to admit defeat. "I have been mistaken," he said. "It is impossible to give anthrax to a hen." "Well, my dear colleague," Louis Pasteur told the man, "I will show you that it is possible to give anthrax to hens. In fact, I will one day bring you a hen that has died of the disease." Less than a week later, Louis Pasteur arrived at the Academy of Medicine. He carried a cage containing 3 hens, one of them dead. He presented the 3 birds to the astonished gathering and explained their significance. Louis said, "It occurred to me that a hen's resistance to anthrax may be due to its high body temperature. Its normal temperature is warmer by several degrees than the body temperature of sheep, cattle, and oxen. Most birds have a normal body temperature of about 42 degrees Celsius. Most mammals like sheep and cattle have a normal body temperature of 38 degrees Celsius." Louis explained the experiment. "My coworkers and I selected 3 healthy hens, a white one, a gray one, and a black one. We injected the white one with 5 drops of yeast water that swarmed with the anthrax microorganisms. To lower the white bird's body temperature, we made it a prisoner in a tank by fastening its feet to the bottom. Then we poured in water, covering the lower third of its body. With the bird partially submerged in the water, it soon died of anthrax. The white hen lay dead on the floor of the cage. When treated in this way," Louis Pasteur said, "the hen died of anthrax within 24 hours. Anthrax bacteria filled its body. You will find them in its blood, spleen, lungs, and liver. Perhaps the cold water killed it," one member of the Academy objected. "We placed the gray hen in the same bath at the same temperature during the same time. The gray one you see alive and well. The only difference between them is that we injected one with anthrax germs, but not the other one." "Well, the black hen?" a member asked. Louis said, "We inoculated the black hen at the same time as the white one, but with an even more powerful dose of anthrax. We did not put it in water. You can see how healthy it is. A hen cannot get anthrax unless you lower its temperature." Louis Pasteur was not finished. He told his assistants that he wanted to do a 4th experiment. "Suppose," he said, "we inoculate a hen with anthrax and place it in a water bath until the disease develops. Can we cure the hen of the disease merely by taking it out of the water?" They selected a healthy hen and shot it full of the anthrax bacteria. They left it in the water until it became obvious the disease had taken hold. Then Louis rescued the hen, wrapped it in a warm blanket, and raised its temperature again. The hen recovered completely. The Academy appointed a commission to review these dramatic findings. Professor Collin was a member of the committee. After a thorough investigation, they confirmed Louis Pasteur's work. The committee members signed a report stating their agreement with his claims. Since Professor Collin belonged to the committee, he had to admit in writing that he'd been wrong. Louis Pasteur, however, wasn't satisfied. He knew that he'd taken only tiny steps toward real understanding of the disease. Now he could look for positive ways to save the livestock because he knew the real cause, the anthrax bacteria. Louis told his assistants, "The goal is to learn what transmits the bacteria from one animal to another. How can we prevent its outbreak and spread?" "What shall we do?" Emile Roux asked. "Along with our work in the laboratory," Louis said, "we need a field station in the country." He sent Charles Chamberlain and Emile Roux to Chartres for the summer. "I have other duties in Paris," Louis told them. "Later, I'll join you on the scene." Later that fall, Louis joined his helpers at the Hôtel de France in Chartres. Each morning they ate breakfast and then rode off to Saint-Germain. Their friendly farmer put his flocks at their disposal. As soon as Louis left the carriage, he hurried to the sheep yards. He stood motionless by the gate to keep from disturbing the animals. He spent hours watching a sheep that seemed to be growing sick. At the close of day, Emile Roux said, "It is time to go." Louis merely nodded in his absent-minded way and continued to watch the sheep. A few minutes later, Emile tapped his watch. "Look, it's late and growing dark. We must go." Louis hushed him with a wave of his hand and continued his detailed observation of the sick animal. Emile tried again. "The towers of Chartres Cathedral are beginning to disappear in the darkness." Finally, Emile Roux and Charles Chamberlain pulled Louis away. Louis once again questioned farmers and shepherds. He gave great weight to their opinion. After all, he told his assistants, because of their lonely life, they give their whole attention to their flocks. Often they become the best eyewitnesses. Louis wondered how a field could be accursed. If you let the bodies of animals that die of anthrax decay on the ground, this would explain how the disease struck animals that grazed their year later. In the resting stage, as spores, anthrax germs can infect animals for several years. "We don't let them decay where they fall," one farmer objected. "I always bury the dead animals in deep pits." How do the germs rise to the surface? How indeed? First, Louis tested the farmer's statement. He took a sheep dead of anthrax and buried it in the ground. The next year he returned. He collected a little of the topsoil and took it back to the laboratory to analyze it. Yes, he found anthrax spores in the sample of earth. To prove this, he injected the spores into some guinea pigs. They promptly came down with the disease. How do the spores make it from a deeply buried carcass to the surface of the ground? Louis wondered. He took to walking across fields, looking for an explanation. One day in the fall, Louis visited a farm at Saint-Germain with Monsieur Monnery, the owner. The tenants had harvested the field, leaving only stubble. As Louis looked around, he noticed soil with a brown color. "Why does the ground here have a different color than elsewhere?" Monsieur Monnery explained, "I buried sheep that died of anthrax here last year." Louis paced slowly across the burial site, his eyes observing the ground closely. Monsieur Monnery saw firsthand the powers of Pasteur's concentration. Suddenly, nothing existed for Louis Pasteur but that plot of ground. Louis became completely absorbed in studying it. The little casts of soil are those left by earthworms that have wiggled to the surface? Louis asked. "Yes, I suppose so," the landowner said. "Ah," Louis said. An idea dawned on him. This explains how the spores reach the surface. The earthworms in their ceaseless trips from the lower levels bring up the anthrax spores. To test this idea, Louis dug up some earthworms. He dissected one of them and checked its alimentary canal. Yes, he found anthrax spores in the earthworm. Simply burying infected livestock isn't enough, Louis decided. "Burn the bodies," he told the farmers. "If you must bury them, then do it deep in the ground where sheep and cattle will never be allowed to graze. Choose sandy or chalky soils which have few earthworms. Although farmers praised Louis Pasteur for this important advice, Louis had no illusions about its worth. He learned why a field might appear accursed. However, he had no cure for the disease. Livestock still died of anthrax. During these studies, Louis noticed a remarkable fact. If an animal recovered from anthrax, it resisted further attack, even when deliberately infected. At the time, Louis saw no practical use of this information. Later, however, he would realize its importance.